One man, one machine gun. An entire German armored division bearing down through the frozen hell of the Ardennes. What Sergeant José Mendoza López did on December 17, 1944 should have been impossible. The odds were insurmountable, the situation hopeless, his survival a statistical impossibility. Yet somehow, through sheer will and deadly precision, this lone soldier stopped the momentum of Hitler's last great offensive in the West. This is the story of how one sergeant held the line when everyone else had fallen, and changed the course of the Battle of the Bulge. The dawn of December 17, 1944, broke over the Ardennes Forest with the kind of bitter cold that makes men question every decision that brought them to such a godforsaken place. Sergeant José Mendoza López stood in the frozen darkness near the small Belgian village of Krinkelt, his breath forming thick clouds in the air that hung suspended like ghosts before dissipating into the gray pre-dawn gloom. The temperature had plummeted well below freezing during the night, and now a thick fog rolled through the pine forests, clinging to the snow-laden branches and obscuring the landscape in an eerie, shifting whiteness that seemed to muffle all sound. López was not a stranger to war. He had seen action before, had felt the earth shake beneath artillery barrages, had heard the sharp crack of rifle fire and the wet thump of bullets finding flesh. But something about this morning felt different. The fog was too thick, the silence too complete. The air itself seemed charged with an electricity that made the hair on the back of his neck stand on end. His Company K, part of the 23rd Infantry Regiment, 3rd Infantry Division, had been holding positions in this sector for days now, enduring the cold, the sporadic shelling, the exhausting routine of watch rotations and patrol duties that ground men down as surely as any direct assault. The machine gun position where López stood was one of several that formed the defensive line protecting the approach to Krinkelt and the vital Elsenborn Ridge beyond. The Browning M1919 machine gun, a weapon that had proven itself time and again in this terrible war, sat mounted on its tripod, its barrel pointed toward the tree line where the fog thickened into an impenetrable wall. The weapon was a thing of brutal efficiency, weighing 65 pounds with its tripod and ammunition, capable of spitting out 500 rounds per minute of .30-06 ammunition that could tear through flesh and light cover with devastating effect. López knew this weapon intimately. He had trained with it, maintained it, fired thousands upon thousands of rounds through its barrel. The Browning was an extension of his will, a tool he could wield with the precision of a surgeon and the violence of a sledgehammer. But as the morning light struggled to penetrate the fog, López became aware of something that turned his stomach to ice. The other machine gun positions, the ones that should have been manned by his fellow gunners, were silent. Too silent. During the night, German artillery had found their range with uncanny accuracy. The screaming descent of shells, the earth-shattering explosions that sent geysers of frozen soil and snow skyward, the shrapnel that whined through the air like angry hornets, all of it had taken a terrible toll. López had heard the cries for medics, had seen the flash of explosions illuminating the night in brief, hellish snapshots of carnage. Now in the cold light of dawn, the reality was undeniable. The other machine gun teams were dead or wounded, evacuated or too broken to fight. He was alone. The weight of that realization settled on López's shoulders like a physical burden. Company K's defensive line depended on interlocking fields of fire from multiple machine gun positions. Without those other guns, there were gaps, weak points that any competent enemy force would exploit without mercy. And the enemy they faced was not merely competent. Intelligence reports had been filtering back for days now about massive German troop movements, about the concentration of armor and elite infantry units in the forests to the east. The 6th SS Panzer Army, including elements of the fearsome 12th SS Panzer Division, were known to be in the area. These were not the worn-down, demoralized conscripts that the Allies had been facing since the breakout from Normandy. These were Hitler's fanatics, his elite troops, backed by the most powerful tanks in the German arsenal. The sound came first as a distant rumble, so low and deep that López felt it in his chest before he consciously heard it. Then, cutting through the fog like the growl of some mechanical beast, came the unmistakable clank and squeal of tank tracks. The fog-distorted sound made it impossible to judge distance or direction with any accuracy, but López's combat-honed instincts told him that what was coming was massive. Through the shifting curtains of mist, he caught glimpses of movement in the tree line. Shadows that resolved into human shapes, dozens of them, then hundreds, moving with the practiced efficiency of veteran soldiers. The German infantry was advancing, and behind them, somewhere in that fog-shrouded forest, came the tanks. López's mind raced through his options. He could fall back, try to link up with the main body of Company K, report that the position was untenable. That would be the sensible thing, the thing that would keep him alive to fight another day. But if he fell back, the Germans would pour through the gap where his position had been. They would flank Company K, roll up the defensive line, push toward Krinkelt and the vital high ground of Elsenborn Ridge beyond. The entire sector could collapse, and with it, the Allied defensive line in this part of the Ardennes. López looked at his Browning, at the ammunition belt stacked beside it, at the frozen ground he had been tasked to defend. The decision, when it came, was not really a decision at all. It was simply what had to be done. The first German soldiers emerged from the fog line like wraiths, their white winter camouflage making them nearly invisible against the snow. They moved in extended line formation, weapons at the ready, advancing with the confidence of men who knew they had overwhelming force on their side. López let them come closer, his hand steady on the Browning's spade grips, his eye tracking their movement. The distance closed to 400 yards, then 300. He could see individual soldiers now, could make out the coal scuttle helmets, the MP-40 submachine guns, the stick grenades hanging from their belts. 250 yards, 200. The moment hung suspended in the frozen air, everything crystalline and perfect and terrible. López pressed the trigger and the Browning roared to life. The sound was deafening, a rapid hammering that shattered the morning quiet like a physical blow. Brass casings ejected in a glittering arc, falling to the snow with a metallic tinkle that was lost beneath the gun's thunder. The tracer rounds painted red lines through the fog, and where those lines intersected with human bodies, men fell. The effect on the German line was immediate and catastrophic. Soldiers dropped mid-stride, tumbled forward into the snow, sprawled in the awkward, boneless poses of the suddenly dead. Others dove for cover, scrambling behind whatever concealment they could find. Their advance halted as if they had run into an invisible wall. But López knew that his initial volley, devastating as it was, had done something far worse than simply inflict casualties. It had revealed his position. The muzzle flash of the Browning, the tracer rounds, the sound itself, all of it pointed like a giant arrow to exactly where he was. And the Germans, veteran soldiers that they were, would not make the mistake of advancing blindly into that fire again. They would suppress his position, flank it, destroy it. He had perhaps minutes, maybe only seconds, before the counterstroke fell. The first mortar rounds came whistling down with their characteristic descending shriek, impacting in the snow around López's position with sharp cracks that sent shrapnel humming through the air. He could hear the wet smack of fragments hitting the sandbags of his position, could feel the concussive impact through the frozen earth. Then came the heavier stuff, the artillery, the shrieking descent of 105mm shells that exploded with earth-shattering violence, each one a miniature son of fire and steel that left craters in the snow and set trees ablaze despite the wet cold. The barrage was precise, concentrated, designed to pulverize his position and everything in it. López knew he could not stay where he was. The Germans had his range, and it was only a matter of time before a shell landed directly in his hole. But the other machine gun positions were unmanned, and Company K's left flank was exposed. If he was going to make a difference, if he was going to do anything other than die uselessly in this hole, he needed to move. The Browning, with its tripod and the ammunition he could carry, weighed over 65 pounds. In the deep snow, across open ground, under fire, it would be like carrying another man on his back. But there was no choice. López broke down the gun with movements born of endless repetition, muscle memory taking over where conscious thought became sluggish in the adrenaline and fear. Barrel off, tripod collapsed, ammunition belts draped over his shoulders like metallic serpents. The weight settled onto him, and he heaved himself out of the fighting position and began to move. The snow was knee-deep in places, sometimes deeper where the wind had piled it into drifts. Each step was an effort, his boots breaking through the crust and sinking deep, his legs burning with the strain of lifting them free and pushing forward. Behind him, another salvo of artillery screamed down, impacting exactly where he had been moments before, the explosion so close that the pressure wave pushed him forward and snow cascaded down from the shaken trees. He ran, if such labored movement could be called running, toward a position on the left flank that would give him a field of fire across the German advance. The distance was perhaps 200 yards, but it felt like 2 miles. His lungs burned with the cold air, his legs trembled with exhaustion, the weight of the gun and ammunition seemed to increase with every step. Around him, the battlefield had erupted into full chaos. Company K was engaged all along the line now, the crack of M1 Garand rifles mixing with the slower, heavier reports of German Mausers. The peculiar sound of German machine guns, the faster cyclic rate giving them an almost tearing quality, ripped through the air. Somewhere to his left, an American bazooka team was engaging targets, the whoosh crack of the rocket launch followed by the metallic clang of its striking armor. López reached a shell crater near the edge of the tree line, a depression in the snow and frozen earth that would provide some cover and a decent field of fire. His hands, numbed by cold and trembling with exhaustion, worked to set up the Browning. Tripod down, gun mounted, barrel in place, ammunition belt fed into the receiver. The movements were automatic, performed without conscious thought even as his eyes scanned the fog for targets. And then, emerging from the mist like a vision from a nightmare, he saw it. The Tiger tank. The Tiger was a monster 56 tons of steel and violence. Its long 88mm main gun capable of destroying any Allied tank at ranges that made return fire impossible. This close, the sound of it was overwhelming, the roar of its engine, the squeal of its tracks, the grinding of its transmission, all combining into a mechanical symphony of impending death. The tank's hull was angled, its armor thick enough to shrug off most anti-tank weapons the Americans possessed. Behind it, using the massive vehicle as a shield, came more German infantry, SS Panzer Grenadiers in their distinctive camouflage smocks, advancing with weapons ready. López swung the Browning toward the infantry, knowing that his machine gun was useless against the tank's armor but determined to take down as many of the supporting infantry as possible. He fired in controlled bursts, the way he had been trained, 3 to 5 rounds per burst, walking the fire across the advancing line of soldiers. Men fell, tumbled, clutched at wounds, and went down screaming into the snow. The Browning's barrel glowed cherry red even in the cold, the heat of its sustained fire turning the falling snow to steam where it touched the metal. Brass casings piled up around López's position, a glittering mound of spent destruction. The Tiger tank traversed its turret with ponderous inevitability, the long barrel of the 88mm gun swinging toward López's position. He saw it happening, knew what was coming, but he could not stop firing. Every second he kept shooting was another second that Company K's withdrawal could be organized, another moment that the German advance was slowed. The world seemed to compress into a single point of clarity, everything becoming sharp and bright and impossibly slow. He saw the muzzle flash of the Tiger's main gun, a brilliant orange bloom that seemed impossibly large. Then the world ended. The impact of the 88mm high-explosive shell was beyond description. The explosion was not merely sound, but a physical presence that picked López up and threw him through the air like a child's toy. The shockwave compressed his lungs, made his ears ring with a high-pitched whine that drowned out all other sound, turned his vision into a chaos of white and red and black. He hit the ground 10 feet from where he had been, landing in a drift of snow that cushioned the impact but still drove the air from his lungs in a painful whoosh. For several seconds, he simply lay there, unable to move, unable to think, unable to do anything but exist in a haze of shock and pain. The ringing in his ears slowly resolved into other sounds. The continued crack of rifle fire, the thump of mortars, the screams of wounded men, the relentless advance of the German armor. López's vision cleared enough to see his Browning lying a few feet away, half buried in the snow, miraculously intact despite the direct hit. His body responded sluggishly to his commands, muscles screaming in protest as he forced himself to crawl toward the weapon. His hands closed around the Browning's barrel, still hot enough that he could feel the warmth even through his gloves, and he began to drag it back toward the meager cover of the shell crater. Every instinct screamed at him to stay down, to find deeper cover, to wait for the assault to pass and pray that he survived. But López had never been one to listen to the voice of self-preservation when duty called. He had joined the army to serve, to protect, to stand as a shield against tyranny and evil. He had taken an oath, and that oath meant something. It meant everything. So despite the pain, despite the exhaustion, despite the rational certainty that what he was doing was suicide, José Mendoza López set up his Browning once more and prepared to fight. The German infantry had used the confusion of the tank's shot to advance, and now they were dangerously close, within 100 yards of his position. López could see their faces now, see the determination in their eyes, the frost clinging to their collars, the fog of their breath in the cold air. Some part of his mind registered that these were just men, soldiers doing their duty as he was doing his, but that thought was buried beneath the primal imperative of survival and the tactical necessity of stopping their advance. He opened fire. The Browning spoke again, its voice hoarse and angry, spitting death in controlled bursts that scythed through the German ranks. The SS Panzer Grenadiers went to ground, their advance stalling as men died or sought cover. López shifted his aim, tracking new targets, firing, adjusting, firing again. The ammunition belt fed through the receiver in a steady stream, empty casings ejecting to pile at his feet. His world compressed to the simple mechanics of killing. Acquire target, center sight picture, squeeze trigger, watch the tracer rounds reach out and touch someone, move to next target. Again, and again, and again. The Germans brought up their own machine guns, the MG-42s that were arguably superior to the Browning in many ways. The distinctive sound of their firing, that rapid tearing noise that had earned them the nickname of Hitler's buzzsaw, cut through the air. Rounds snapped past López's position, some so close he could feel the air displacement, others kicking up fountains of snow where they impacted. Return fire from Company K's positions was sporadic now, the company clearly under enormous pressure all along its line. López could hear officers shouting orders, sergeants bellowing commands, the organized chaos of a unit fighting for its life. The ammunition belt ran dry with a metallic click that was somehow audible despite the cacophony of battle. López's hands moved automatically, reaching for a fresh belt, feeding it into the receiver, charging the weapon. But he knew he could not stay in this position much longer. The Germans knew exactly where he was now, and they were maneuvering to flank him. He could see soldiers moving through the trees to his left, trying to get an angle on his position. If he stayed here, they would kill him, and then they would roll over Company K's exposed flank. So López moved again. He broke down the gun with shaking hands, shouldered the weapon and the remaining ammunition, and began another agonizing movement across the frozen battlefield. This time he headed toward what had been 2nd Squad's position, a small rise that would give him both cover and a commanding field of fire. The Germans saw him move and adjusted their fire, rounds cracking through the air around him, one so close it tugged at his jacket like an impatient hand. He fell once, the weight of the gun and his exhaustion sending him sprawling into the snow, but he forced himself up and kept moving. The new position was slightly better, a fallen log providing some cover and the rise giving him a better view of the battlefield. López set up the Browning with movements that were becoming increasingly mechanical, his body operating on automatic while his mind seemed to float somewhere above, watching this insane one-man stand with a detached sense of unreality. Was he really doing this? Was this actually happening? The question seemed absurd in the face of the immediate need to load, aim, and fire. So that is what he did. The German advance had faltered but not stopped. New units were moving up, now fresh troops that had not yet tasted the fury of López's gun. The Tiger tank was still there, a malevolent presence that dominated the battlefield, its main guns swiveling back and forth searching for targets. López knew he was playing a deadly game, knew that every time he fired he was revealing his position and inviting destruction. But what choice did he have? If he did not fire, the Germans would advance. If he did not slow them down, Company K would be overrun. So he fired. The Browning hammered out its deadly rhythm and Germans fell. The snow around their bodies turned red, steaming in the cold air. The Tiger traversed its turret toward his new position, but before it could fire, López was moving again, dragging his weapon to yet another location. He was creating the illusion of multiple machine gun teams, of a defensive position that was stronger than it actually was. The Germans, cautious now, slowed their advance, trying to identify and suppress what they believed were numerous American machine gun nests. Time became meaningless in the chaos of battle. Seconds stretched into hours, minutes compressed into instants. López lost count of how many times he fired, how many belts of ammunition he expended, how many men fell to his gun. His world was reduced to the simplest possible equation. Identify threat, engage threat, move to new position, repeat. His shoulders ached from the weight of the gun and ammunition. His hands were raw inside his gloves from the constant manipulation of the weapon. His legs trembled with exhaustion every time he forced himself to move, but still he fought. Company K was pulling back now, conducting a fighting withdrawal toward Krinkelt. López could see soldiers moving in pairs and small groups, covering each other, dragging wounded comrades, maintaining discipline even in retreat. Officers were directing the movement, sergeants were keeping the men together, and slowly, grudgingly, the company was disengaging from the German assault. But they needed time, needed someone to keep the Germans' heads down long enough for the withdrawal to succeed. That someone was Sergeant José Mendoza López. He found more ammunition in one of the abandoned positions, belts that had been left behind when the crew was killed or wounded. His hands shook as he fed a fresh belt into the Browning, the weapon's barrel now almost glowing despite the frigid temperature. The gun was overheating, pushing past its designed limits, but López could not give it time to cool. He continued to fire, shorter bursts now to conserve both ammunition and barrel life, each burst precisely aimed to maximum effect. The Germans were getting smarter, adapting to his tactics. They began advancing under cover of their own suppressive fire, using terrain more effectively, moving in smaller groups that were harder to engage. The Tiger tank, frustrated by López's constant movement, began firing high-explosive shells into the tree line, trying to catch him with splash damage even if it could not score a direct hit. Trees exploded into splinters, branches fell like rain, and the forest itself seemed to be dying around him. López repositioned to what he knew would be his final stand. There was a small depression behind a cluster of boulders that offered decent cover and a view of the withdrawal route. If he could hold here long enough, Company K would reach Krinkelt and the more defensible positions there. That was all that mattered now. Not survival, not medals, not glory. Just buying enough time for his brothers in arms to escape the trap that was closing around them. He set up the Browning one last time, his movements slow and clumsy now, exhaustion making even simple tasks difficult. The weapon was in bad shape, the barrel warped from overheating, the receiver fouled with carbon and dirt. By all rights it should have jammed or failed by now, but the Browning was a weapon that had been designed for exactly this kind of punishment. It would keep firing as long as López kept feeding it ammunition. And López had no intention of stopping until every last round was expended. The final German push came with renewed intensity. They had identified his position and were determined to eliminate this maddening American who had single-handedly stalled their advance and inflicted horrific casualties. SS Panzer Grenadiers, some of the best infantry Germany had, came at him from three sides. The Tiger tank advanced as well, using its bulk to shield infantry, while its machine guns raked the area around López's position with grazing fire. López fired until his ammunition ran out, the Browning's bolt locking back on an empty chamber with a finality that seemed impossibly loud. He looked at the weapon, then at the advancing Germans, then back toward Krinkelt where the last of Company K was disappearing into defensive positions. He had done it. He had bought them enough time. The realization brought with it a strange sense of peace. If this was where his war ended, at least it would end knowing he had done his duty. But López was not done. With no ammunition remaining, he grabbed the Browning by its barrel and swung it like a club at the first German soldier to reach his position. The impact sent the man sprawling, his helmet flying off, blood streaming from a gash on his forehead. López swung again, the heavy weapon an ungainly but effective bludgeon. Other Germans hesitated, shocked by this display of suicidal courage, this refusal to surrender even when all was clearly lost. American voices shouting his name, calling for him to fall back. Covering fire from Company K's new positions, rifle shots that cracked over his head and forced the Germans to take cover. Hands grabbing him, pulling him back, other soldiers from his company who had risked their lives to come back for him. López stumbled, fell, was hauled upright, half carried and half dragged back toward the American lines. Behind them the Germans regrouped, but their advance had been broken. The momentum of the 6th SS Panzer Army's assault in this sector had been stopped, not by a regiment or a battalion, but by one sergeant with one machine gun and a determination that defied all logic and reason. In the days that followed, as the Battle of the Bulge raged across the Ardennes, the action at Krinkelt became one of many small but crucial engagements that determined the battle's outcome. The German offensive, Hitler's last desperate gamble to split the Allied armies and capture the vital port of Antwerp, had counted on speed and momentum. Every hour of delay, every strongpoint that held longer than expected, every roadblock that forced the panzers to find alternate routes, all of it degraded the German timetable and gave the Americans time to rush reinforcements into the breach. Sergeant López's stand, his impossible solo defense against overwhelming odds, had bought Company K the time it needed to withdraw to defensible positions. That withdrawal allowed the regiment to hold Krinkelt and the Elsenborn Ridge beyond it. And the Elsenborn Ridge, that vital piece of high ground, became the northern shoulder of the Bulge, the anvil against which German attacks broke and failed. The Germans never took Elsenborn Ridge. The 6th SS Panzer Army, frustrated by unexpected American resistance, by heroism in places like Krinkelt, by soldiers like José Mendoza López who simply refused to break, ground itself to pieces against American defenses. The offensive, which Hitler had promised would throw the Allies into the sea, instead bled the Wehrmacht white and ensured that Germany would lose the war. All because of men who held when holding seemed impossible, who fought when fighting seemed futile, who did their duty even when their duty demanded everything they had to give. Months later, when the snow had melted and spring was returning to the scarred forest of the Ardennes, Sergeant José Mendoza López stood at attention as the Medal of Honor was placed around his neck. The citation spoke of extraordinary heroism, of actions above and beyond the call of duty, of conspicuous gallantry in the face of overwhelming enemy forces. But the words, official and formal as they were, could not truly capture what had happened on that frozen morning in December. They could not convey the weight of that machine gun, the cold that numbed fingers and froze breath, the terror of facing tanks and elite infantry with nothing but determination, and a Browning that should have failed a dozen times but kept firing because its operator refused to let it fail. The medal was heavy around his neck, but not as heavy as that Browning had been. The ribbons were colorful but not as vivid as the tracer rounds had been in the fog. The ceremony was dignified and proper, but it could not match the intensity of those moments when every decision was literally life or death, when every second counted, when one man stood between chaos and order. López accepted the medal with quiet dignity, as was his nature. He did not speak of glory or heroism. When asked about that day, he spoke instead of duty, of the men of Company K who had depended on him, of the simple fact that someone had to hold that line and he happened to be the one in position to do it. There was no boasting in his words, no false modesty either, just the plain truth as he saw it. He had been a soldier with a job to do, and he had done it to the best of his ability. That the job had required him to stand alone against impossible odds was simply how it had worked out. But others who were there, the men of Company K who had withdrawn under the covering fire of his lone Browning, they knew what López had done. They had seen him move from position to position under fire, had watched him engage tanks and infantry with equal determination, had witnessed his refusal to quit even when quitting would have been the rational choice. They told stories of his stand, stories that grew with the telling but which needed no embellishment to be remarkable. They spoke of him with the kind of reverence reserved for those rare individuals who, when faced with an impossible situation, somehow find a way to do the impossible. The Battle of the Bulge would be remembered as Hitler's last offensive in the West, as the largest battle fought by the American army in World War II, as the engagement that finally broke the back of the Wehrmacht. History books would document the movements of armies, the decisions of generals, the grand strategic implications of the German defeat. But wars are not won by armies in the abstract or by strategies on maps. They are won by individual soldiers in individual moments, by men like Sergeant José Mendoza López who stand their ground when standing seems impossible, who fight when fighting seems futile, who simply refuse to break no matter what is thrown at them. On December 17, 1944, near the small Belgian village of Krinkeld, one sergeant with one machine gun changed the course of a battle. His actions, multiplied by thousands of similar acts of courage by soldiers whose names are less well known but whose contributions were no less vital, determined the outcome of the Battle of the Bulge. The Germans were stopped not because they faced overwhelming force, but because they faced men who would not yield. And at the tip of that resistance, holding the line when it should have collapsed, was Sergeant José Mendoza López. The frozen forests of the Ardennes eventually thawed. The snow melted, revealing the debris of battle, the shell craters and burned-out vehicles, and all the other scars of war. Spring came, as it always does, and then summer, and then the war ended. The soldiers who survived went home, returned to lives interrupted by the call to duty, tried to find normalcy in a world that had been forever changed by what they had seen and done. Many struggled with memories that would not fade, with dreams that replayed the worst moments, with the complicated burden of survival when so many others had fallen. But they had done what was asked of them and more. They had stood against tyranny and evil, had given everything they had, and had prevailed. José Mendoza López returned home a hero, though he never thought of himself in those terms. The Medal of Honor was a heavy thing, not in its physical weight but in what it represented. Every time he looked at it, he saw the faces of the men from Company K, saw the frozen battlefield, heard the thunder of his Browning and the screams of the wounded. The medal was not his alone. It belonged to every soldier who had stood in the snow that December morning, to everyone who had held the line when the line should have broken, to all those who had given their all so that freedom might prevail. The years passed as years do. The Battle of the Bulge became history, then became the subject of films and books, then slowly began to fade from living memory as the soldiers who had fought there aged and passed away. But the lessons of that battle, the examples set by men like López, those remained. They remained as a testament to what ordinary people can achieve when faced with extraordinary circumstances. They remained as proof that courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite fear. They remained as a reminder that individuals matter, that one person can make a difference, That standing for what is right when standing seems impossible is sometimes the most important thing a human being can do. So now we ask you, the audience, to remember this story. Remember Sergeant José Mendoza López, who carried a 65-pound machine gun through deep snow under fire, who fought alone against overwhelming odds, who created the illusion of a defended line through sheer determination and tactical brilliance, who refused to break when breaking would have been understandable and forgivable. Remember that one man in one moment on one frozen morning in Belgium did something that should have been impossible, and in doing so changed history. Could you imagine yourself in his position, standing alone against such impossible odds? Could you picture carrying that machine gun through the snow, setting it up again and again while shells exploded around you and bullets cracked through the air? Could you see yourself firing that weapon until your ammunition ran out, then using it as a club because surrender was simply not an option? What would you have done in Sergeant López's place? Would you have had the courage to stand when every instinct screamed at you to run? Would you have had the strength to keep fighting when fighting seemed futile? These are not easy questions, and perhaps there are no right answers. But they are worth asking, worth contemplating, because understanding heroism helps us understand what humanity is capable of achieving. If this story has moved you, if Sergeant López's incredible stand against the 6th SS Panzer Army has left you in awe, then please, take a moment to like this video, to subscribe to our channel, to share this story with others who need to hear it. These tales of courage and sacrifice deserve to be remembered, deserve to be passed on to future generations, deserve to be told and retold so that we never forget what was done in the cause of freedom. Leave a comment below telling us what you think. Share your thoughts on López's actions. Tell us if you know of other similar stories of incredible bravery that deserve to be brought to light. Engage with this history, make it part of your understanding of the world, and in doing so, honor the memory of all those who stood fast when standing fast was the only thing between civilization and darkness. The snow has long since melted from the forests around Krinkelt. The shell craters have filled in, the trees have regrown, the land has healed its visible scars. But what happened there on December 17, 1944, remains as powerful and relevant today as it was 80 years ago. It remains as proof that ordinary people can do extraordinary things, that courage exists even in the darkest moments, that one person really can make a difference. Sergeant José Mendoza López proved all of that and more. His stand at Krinkelt was impossible, but he did it anyway. And because he did, Company K survived, the line held, the German offensive faltered, and ultimately freedom prevailed. That is a story worth remembering, worth sharing, worth honoring. That is the legacy of one sergeant, one machine gun, and one impossible stand in the frozen hell of the Ardennes.